I've been a glass pad main for the past 4 years, but it's only partially by choice. At first, I was sold on glass pads for the same reason that most people were. They were extremely fast mouse pads that were ultra responsive to all of your muscle movements and allowed for really easy directional changes and micro adjustments. I loved them. I never really looked back for the first 3 years of getting into the niche. Since then, I've used over a dozen different glass surfaces. But after using glass for so long, I feel like I can't go back to cloth. I tried to. There were parts of aiming with cloth that I missed, but my technique had become so centered around glass that I could not stick with any cloth pad for more than a week or two. All of them ended up feeling too sluggish or sticky over time. But the Artisan Key83 Mid is the first cloth mousepad in existence that I think might fit what I need as a glass main well enough to finally make the switch. But first, I need to talk about why this pad is so different from the others in their lineup. Trying a new Artisan mousepad has always been a little bit bittersweet for me. Every time I'd get one, I'd go through the same set of emotions. Wow, this thing is high quality. It feels amazing. I'm aiming really well with it. The friction is incredibly balanced. Maybe I could main this from now on. But as time passed, the same thing would happen. I'd get sweaty during a session, or the weather would start getting more humid, and suddenly my arm would become completely immobile. I'd start using my wrist and fingers for everything because getting my arm moving from a standstill became impossible. Because I'd spent so much time with glass, there were parts of my aiming technique that had become reliant on it. The main ones are pushing into the pad and solving that arm stickiness. One of my original reasons for getting into glass in the first place was trying to solve an issue of death gripping my mouse when I'd get nervous. Because glass is so sensitive to small movements, you'll be made aware of when you're tensing and can make a more conscious effort to combat it. As I continued to use glass, this issue did become less prominent, but only years later did I realize that this was only a half solution. I was still tensing under pressure, but because glass's friction doesn't change while pressing into the pad, I could still aim while my hand was applying downwards pressure. Glass allowed me to work around the issue, and I needed that consistent friction to keep my aim stable and agile while tense. Arm stickiness was the other unexpected benefit. While glass is notorious for being extremely sticky on your arm, and many reviewers will begrudgingly say you have to use a sleeve, I ended up actually really liking it. With cloth, I was either stuck with my arm getting glued to the pad or sleeves tucking on the pad, but with glass, it was perfectly smooth. And as I got more into target switching and wanted to start improving my flick speed, I came to realize that mouse pads with more friction were actually much easier to have clean switching with. Stopping all of that momentum on such a fast surface started to create problems that required workarounds that I wasn't totally happy with. But I was still stuck as a glass one trick. Even if my switching was better on cloth, sacrificing the other two things I had been relying on would be a huge nerf to my overall aim and comfort. I started trying to find slower glass pads that would get me some of the benefits of more controlled pads, but none of them really stuck for me. It started to bother me. I was about to start dipping into some bizarre control pads that I've never seen anybody main to try and find what I was looking for. And that's when the Key83 Mid arrived. I thought it would be a fun thing to try and good to have some experience with so I can compare other pads to it. But the Key83 Mid was the unexpected answer to my problem. But why? At a glance, it doesn't look significantly different to any of Artisan's other cloth pads, and it really is just a cloth pad. No glass infusing or coating, just cloth. The answer is in the weave of the pad, the way the fabric is intertwined. With glass, you have a surface that is completely consistent in terms of friction. Regardless of which direction the mouse is moving, you'll have the same amount of resistance. But Artisan has a few pads that are notorious for having noticeably slower vertical movements because of the weave. The Heian is the one that most people talk about. What's less known is that every cloth pad has some degree of variance between X and Y, with almost all of them having a slightly slower Y-axis. Everyone has gotten used to it, and you never actively consider it while playing. But if we thought about this as an intentional design choice, does it really make sense? It's much easier for our arms and wrists to move horizontally than vertically. I had even used higher Y sensitivity years ago in Quake, because it felt nice to make the vertical motion that game demands easier. But this ideal of directional consistency that glass offers is something that's exclusive to glass. No cloth pad in existence has this property. Until the Key83 was made. The weave of this pad is something that's never been done before, a hexagonal pattern. That pattern is the first one to try and truly solve this issue, creating a cloth pad that is perfectly directionally consistent. Honestly, I can't really weigh in on how much this actually affects aim because glass is also perfectly directionally consistent. But either way, while it doesn't revolutionize the way I aim, you can notice that vertical and diagonal movements are a bit easier, and it's definitely possible that is a factor in why I feel so comfortable using this thing as a glass and fingertip main. The Key83 does actually feel slightly faster on vertical movements, but it's still closer to balance than any other pad I've used. However, that's not really the main reason that I like the weave so much. It actually has a secondary benefit that I've never experienced with cloth before. Sleeve compatibility. There were occasionally combos that worked, often thicker, more rigid sleeves could work on smooth surfaces like the Raiden, but this pad lets me use my lightweight, stretchy sleeve and have it actually work nearly as well as glass. It's worth noting that it's not good with all of my sleeves, and I might have to include a link to my obscure Japanese sleeve that I bought 5 years ago until somebody else finds a compatible one. Because as of now, rotating the pad 90 degrees and using this sleeve, or keeping the pad oriented the normal way and turning it inside out, are the only times that I've found that this pad can rival glass. The procision sleeve, the one that Maddie uses, also worked pretty well, and I'd wager that other thicker sleeves would be less fussy too. There is still a bit of variance between X and Y on my arm, unlike glass, and blending muscle groups is not quite as easy, but I'm getting better with practice. It's a bit finicky, but it's the first time that I can say that I'm comfortable playing with a sleeve on cloth, and that's an achievement. Without a sleeve, it's nothing to write home about really. It's about the same as every other Artisan mid pad in terms of stickiness and moisture resistance. But that still leaves pressing down into the pad under pressure, and it actually doesn't change the friction basically at all either. I honestly don't understand why, and I don't even know if this was intentional design, but that's both of the main factors that have kept me using glass, all while getting access to the quality of life and aim benefits that cloth provides. The mid variant is actually a very quick pad too. I'd say it's only a touch slower than the Artisan Soft, which is in the conversation for the fastest pure cloth pad in existence. But with these two glass benefits built into a cloth pad, I felt at home with this thing immediately. This was from my first game with it. It just felt so intuitive to pick up. I was able to use this pad's friction to aid my stops and let me send wide, fast flicks without over-relying on tension, and my arm was properly involved in my aim thanks to the sleeve. In theory, this should be the pad that lets me main cloth again. So I tried maining it for 2 weeks now, and this is what I found. Similar to my observations with the Beast, the Key83 has a graininess to it that isn't unpleasant at all. I couldn't really stand using the Heian because of its abrasiveness, and even the Zero Mid was a little bit too much sensory input for me. But the Key83 has a nice bit of texture without any sort of discomfort that provides a bit of extra feedback to my aim. And this micro texture is perceptible through your skates too, not to the extent of the Heian or Otsu, but still enough to be useful. I think that this pad ends up feeling more controllable than its speed in a vacuum would imply, thanks to this. Another thing this pad made me realize is how maining glass affected my mouse resets. It was entirely subconscious, but on glass I'd been lifting the mouse a bit more carefully in order to not make a lot of noise when placing it back on the pad. I did get pretty good at doing it smoothly, but it's not something I have to worry about at all with cloth, and it's starting to let me speed up that process a bit more now. It was also nice to not have to worry about dust. New glass pads have gotten much better about it, but having it be a complete non-issue was a welcome change. And while I did miss the ultra low static friction in some cases, this pad is still very fast and is as balanced as they come, which isn't necessarily an objective positive. Sometimes people prefer to have slightly higher relative static friction to aid stability, and others will prefer to have relatively higher dynamic friction to have a bit of extra help with stopping. With the Key83 being as balanced as it is, it doesn't hold your hand at all. Shakiness on your stops or unstable mouse control will be visible in your aim, but there's also no type of aim that it'll have a particular weakness with. And coming from glass, being punished for shakiness and poor mouse control was something I was familiar with. It's actually everything I want out of a mousepad, as somebody who has spent so much time with glass but was pining for a few benefits that cloth provides you. For me, the Key83 Mid is the perfect middle ground between cloth and glass. I feel like I'm improving as I adapt my older skill sets to this surface, and I'm steadily learning to incorporate new ones into my style. That said, my use case for glass is a bit weird. While it is fast, it doesn't have the perfectly effortless micros and directional changes that glass offers you. And it will never give you the smoothness or that air hockey table experience if that's what you're after. It really depends on what you liked about glass. For the more typical review stuff, it's an artisan pad. You can expect all the specs and quality assurance to be top of the line. Though, I will say that the backing on this pad actually impressed me a lot too. Most of my mid-hardness pads require me to put some water in the base for it to properly adhere to the desk, but this one sticks really well. I have zero issues with it moving under use. I also have a bit of experience using the soft variant, and it does maintain a lot of the same characteristics. For me, it wasn't quite as good of an analog for glass, probably because I can push my arm into the pad under pressure and get myself stuck. But the friction on mouse gate stays relatively consistent when pushing down here too. It's not as standout of a feature here, and during my test period with the soft, which actually came before the mid, I didn't take note of it. It's also quite a bit slower, probably closer to the Zero or Otsu in terms of speed. The Key83 is also a bit finicky with skates. It doesn't have night and day differences like Class does, but it does have noticeably different performance with different skates, which is pretty rare with cloth pads. You can always just go with Jades though. With all that in mind, who is this pad for? If you have the exact same use case as me, then yeah. This thing has actually given me so much motivation to play and practice, and it's really fun to be able to use a cloth pad so comfortably. But even if you aren't a recovering glass addict, it's still among Artisan's most innovative pads, and anybody curious about how directional consistency feels on cloth would probably enjoy trying this thing out. Behind its uniqueness is also just a very well balanced pad that provides a lot of feedback and is an extremely consistent surface. I don't know, I really don't have much to say that's negative about it. I guess there will probably be people who prefer slower pads, or people who would find this grainy texture unpleasant. And maybe there are even people who prefer having more controlled vertical movements, but I think the vast majority of people would have very few complaints with this pad. Thanks for watching.